This past week, we were on our annual community days for the Companions of the Cross, and ordinarily we all gather in person in Ottawa, but just like last year, some gathered in Ottawa, some of the priests and seminarians, and several of us zoomed in. Father Brian and I went down to St. John, New Brunswick, to join Bishop Christian, and realized it had been a whole year that we hadn't seen him in person, so it was a real blessing to be there with him for our community days. One of the areas that we focused on as a community was our common life, or what we refer to as our brotherhood. And we had, a time of prayerful reflection on the words of Father Bob and all that, but also we want to invite our brothers to give us feedback on how we're living out our community life, because we acknowledge that we all have blind spots. We are not always aware of how we're coming across and all that kind of thing. So we want to hear from one another, both constructive criticism, but also words of encouragement, because often God uses others to speak to us. And isn't that true of our spiritual lives, that God uses others to speak to us because we're a little hard of hearing sometimes, right, in our spiritual life. And we can see this in our gospel, that although it was clearly a physical healing that happened from the early church, the church fathers used this man's physical deafness as a comparison to our spiritual deafness. Do you suffer from spiritual deafness of some sort or other? Of course, right? Our spiritual deafness is a result of the fall. The original sin caused this communication breakdown, this communication block between us and God. The good news, of course, is that God restored our connection with Him in Christ Jesus so that we can hear His voice in our hearts. But we have to cooperate with that restoration. We have to do our best to pay attention to His voice. We have to put some effort into listening to the voice of God. Now, sometimes we hear God speak crystal clear. I hope you've had that experience. Perhaps it was a thought or an insight or something you said, and it was just clear. And after it comes out of your mouth or it's in your mind, you go, wow, that's not from me. Like, that's too good to be from me. That's God speaking. Or perhaps you've been talking to someone else about your faith, and you're describing something or other, and they go, that's God speaking to you. And you're like, really? Like, are you sure? Like, I hadn't realized that. Or perhaps you've been part of a group reflecting on the Sunday gospel, and it's amazing how each person in the group has something different, a different insight on the gospel, and they share something, and one of them shares something, and it strikes you, and you go, oh, I needed to hear that, right? God just spoke through that person to me. Now, besides using one another to speak to us, God speaks to us in a very clear, objective, and direct way through the sacred scriptures, especially the gospel, Jesus' own words and actions. And this is God's revelation to us, right? God has revealed Himself to us so that our understanding can be enlightened by faith, and that enlightened by faith we can be guided in how to live our lives in proper relationship to God and our neighbor. And we're so blessed as Catholics to have the official teachings of the Church to safeguard the correct interpretation of the Scriptures. And this interpretation is summarized in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. As well, we're blessed to have the lived tradition of almost 2 millennia of the lives of the saints that put the words of the gospel into action. It's such a blessing to have all of this, and all of these are helps to us. right? In order to hear God speaking clearly to us in the depths of our spirit and in the depths of our conscience. The bishops of the United States produced a document a number of years ago entitled Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, because forming our conscience is a lifelong task. It takes effort. And I love the definition that they give for conscience. First, they say what it is not. They say conscience is not something that allows us to justify doing whatever we want, nor is it mere feeling about what we should or should not do. Rather, conscience is the voice of God, resounding in the human heart, revealing the truth to us and calling us to do what is good while shunning what is evil. Right? Conscience is the voice of God, resounding in the human heart. God speaks to us in our conscience on how to live in proper relationship to Him and others. Now, this document by the U.S. bishops was produced as a voter's guide because our conscience is engaged in every aspect of our lives, including how we discern who to vote for. In other words, God has something to say about who we are to vote for. Now, because that can be difficult, right? There's just so many issues, important and urgent issues that are facing our society. You know, there's a long list of social justice concerns to be addressed, and they're all important. But ultimately, what is most important is based upon the dignity of the human person. The dignity of the human person is the foundation of our human society. Human rights need to flow from our human dignity. In order to properly understand our human dignity, our thinking needs to be enlightened by faith. Our thinking needs to be enlightened by God's revelation of who we are. Again, there's many important issues, but they don't all have the same weight in relation to our human dignity. And our faith has always taught that the right to life is preeminent. Pope Francis summarized this teaching well in just a few sentences when he wrote, "Defense of unborn life is closely linked to the defense of each and every other human right. It involves the conviction that a human being is always sacred and inviolable in any situation and at every stage of development, right, from conception to natural death. Human beings are ends in themselves and never a means of resolving other problems. Once this conviction disappears, so do solid and lasting foundations for the defense of human rights, which would always be subject to the passing whims of the powers that be." The Canadian bishops in their 2019 federal election voters guide said this: "The principles of respect for life from conception to natural death and of the dignity of the human person should influence how Christians assess a party's position on key moral issues. Choosing life also means being always concerned for the weakest among us, physically, economically, and socially." So the point that I'm making is that if the right to life is not upheld, it is not possible to build a just and free society. The dignity of the human person is rooted in the fact that human life is a gift from God. And enlightened by faith, we understand that we are called to be sons and daughters of God. And God speaks this personally to each one of us. He says to each of us, in the depths of our hearts, "You are my beloved daughter. You are my beloved son." When we can hear this clearly spoken to us, it deepens our encounter with God. It deepens our love for Him and for our neighbor, because we realize that they too are His children. And it helps form our conscience, that voice of God resounding in our depths, which in turn guides us to living every aspect of our lives. So God does speak to us, but we don't always hear him because of that spiritual deafness. He desires to heal that and restore our ability to hear him, but we need to cooperate. We need to start with, recognizing that, yeah, I have some spiritual deafness happening, and I have to put some effort into being attentive to the voice of God. And I do need outside help. I need other people speaking into my life, and I need the church's teachings and tradition so that I can clearly hear God. I can clearly hear his voice in the depths of my heart so that I can live my human dignity as his beloved son, as his beloved daughter.